Welcome to the Near Memo, a weekly conversation about search, social, and commerce. What happened, why it matters, and the implications for local. All right, so David, now on to the local, the leak and the local implications of the leak. Your really excellent article from this week and some additional reflections.
Sure. So this is for those of you who have been under a rock or on a off the grid vacation for 2 weeks. Rand Fishkin and Mike King both published an initial analysis of essentially a GitHub repository that had been made public. Unclear if that was accidental or intentional, but they were notified of it by an anonymous source who later came forward as, I think his name is Irfan Azimi, who is frustrated by the fact that Google is so at least non-transparent with its answers, and in some cases misleading, whether that the misleading nature of Google's answers about particular algorithm elements is intentional or not. It clearly is in many cases not the case.
Dahan SEO is who fed Mike King some stuff.
Interesting. Okay.
Not the guy that fed Rand, who was your one you mentioned. Anyways, go ahead. Sorry.
Anyway, the leak contains, something like 14,000 attributes and hundreds of modules that may play a role in Google's algorithm. These are at least data points that Google has been tracking for not just websites, but everything from Google Maps features to YouTube videos to entities and how entities are even sort of compiled. It's a pretty wide-ranging set of documents. Again, this is not an algorithm leak. This is I describe it as these are the buffet of ingredients that Google has access to. We don't know the recipe and whether or not any of these ingredients are still in use or which ones have expired. That said, I did think that there were some interesting putting yourself in the shoes of Google engineers and understand, getting a better understanding of how they think about their job of trying to pull various threads about similar topics and similar websites and similar entities together and present them to users. And so I thought there were a couple of really very much actionable takeaways. Again, even knowing that this is not an algorithm leak, but just the way Google is thinking about things. The first is we did see a ton of references to nav boost and a term called craps, which another ex-Googler, who I won't name here because he deleted the tweet for whatever reason, but confirmed that this is their sort of click-through their click-through algorithm that essentially tries to predict how well a page will perform based on SERP click-through data that they are tracking. And again, Google representatives have long said that this isn't something that's part of the algorithm, but we already knew from the Department of Justice case that was not true, that the government compelled them to say that, yes, it was. And so this notion of craps data that they're using,
which is an acronym, not an adjective.
It's a good thing. You want to be a high craps website or a high craps entity. Anyhow, so if you look at their site architecture documents or their on-site prominence documents, they explicitly say, hey, you should, we're looking at pages that are linked from a website's homepage, but we're also looking at links from the quote unquote high craps pages. So this has a really important, I think, strong suggestion for site architecture, which we've always said, hey, you want to make sure that the pages you want to rank are really well linked from your homepage. But you also, if you have a really high performing blog post, I would say even if that's not exactly relevant to the topic that you want to rank really well in search results, you probably should make sure that the high traffic post is linking to your target page that you do want to get more traffic. So I thought that was one sort of pretty concrete, actionable takeaway that was embedded in these documents. The second one is this notion of Google. It seems to me that Google is tracking location relevance very much at a page level. And so even if a page hasn't been tagged with an explicit location, that it will inherit the location of the parent that is above it in site architecture. So this, again, had some pretty interesting implications for me in terms of site architecture, which is to say, if you are a multi-location business, you probably should be thinking about building your content in localized silos. For example, having one silo for San Francisco, one for Los Angeles, one for Seattle, as opposed to having this horizontal content and simply a link to the location in which you practice or you have a retail location. That you really need to think about, if I want to rank for this thing in this city, it sort of needs to be in a well-structured silo that Google can not inherit, but reverse inherit the location from this sort of higher level page down to the product or service level page. So those were two, I thought, really interesting actionable takeaways that are in the documentation in terms of how Google interprets prominence and relevance of particular web documents.
What is
in the
that?
silo situation where you have these location silos and you maybe don't have a blog, or you have a blog that's very location specific, how do you bring the more general pages that were site-wide into those silos effectively?
I think it means you have to create a localized version of each of those pieces of horizontal content, and put that localized version in each respective silo.
So this is essentially duplicate content, but for the location.
I mean, that's how it gets tagged, but I think that's not necessarily the case. I think you can, especially with ChatGPT and other tools these days, you can ask those products, if you're, pretend you're a particular customer type in such and such a city. What are the questions you ask? And create genuinely unique and compelling content. I don't think that that's a particularly hard thing. I don't think that you just want to swap out city names and do everything else verbatim. We know that content doesn't perform well in search and doesn't perform well with users. So,
one idea just occurred to me while you were talking, David, was just the companies that are doing interesting national research, pods or some storage company could do national research, publish it across the
and then slice,
but then slice it and dice it locally, so that content would then be within each local silo. Yeah. Here's what people in New York are saying. Here's what people in California are saying. Right.
And you do see that in sort of moving companies and storage companies. Right. They tend to have these localized, like, what does it cost to move in Los Angeles? What does it cost to move in San Francisco? What are the top? I just saw, it wasn't Pods. It was another moving company this week had just published some survey about where are people migrating from when they leave Portland, right?
Right.
Like, and
that was
probably
Pods. U-Haul does that. I mean, it may not have been U-Haul, but they do that kind of thing.
But absolutely, Mike, that's a great, you have this sort of centralized hub for, the national version of the study, and then each localized version of that then would live within the silo, not within the hub that's about that topic.
So could it inhabit both, right? In other words, you categorize it in your blog as New York and then link to it from within your New York
Sure,
silo?
You could probably, and you can probably do it even with a rel canonical tag as well. If you wanted to actually create the same exact content, you could just say that the canonical version is in the local silo.
So let me ask a hypothetical question, sort of from a client perspective. So there's a lot of kind of extrapolation coming out of these leak analyses, including what you're doing now, and there's some strategy implications, obviously, that we're talking about, strategy and tactics. How do people proceed in a way that doesn't? How do you proceed with caution here? Sort of test and observe. What would be your recommendation on that?
Sure. So in this case, like, this is just an idea. We don't know if this is actually true, but certainly squares with some of the recommendations even that we've made to our clients. And if you're not sure if this is going to work, you could easily try this in one particular metro area or one particular state where you operate, and create one additional version of that national horizontal content and see how it performs. Does it perform better or worse than your national page did in that market, right? And so I think that that's the way I'd go about testing this particular case, and most of the other modules and attributes that are contained in this leak. One thing, I know we're sort of running short on time here, but one thing I did want to bring up.
Can I just one other suggestion to Greg's point, though, on the craps idea? Firstly, I think it refers to the game of craps, not the physical excrement. I'm just saying,
which is a metaphor for SEO today.
It's actually it's actually an acronym, apparently. But
okay. But so David's point last week on the webinar with Rand was, it's certainly easy enough to identify your highly trafficked pages and be sure that the link profile within that page speaks to these issues. So there's another very easy test, Greg, that can't go wrong. I mean, you can't lose in that one, right? But you certainly can win. So, and this is something that Joy has written about a lot and has had good success with. So it's certainly a legitimate strategy that everybody should be looking at, which is looking at your high quality pages that are generating traffic, and being sure that your appropriate calls to action and link outs are really solid. Sorry, David, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say there's one other thing that's, I think, much harder to test probably, but something that's a noteworthy, again, something that's data that Google has access to. How big a role it plays, we don't know, but the fact that all of this NavBoost data and this CRAPS data appears to be localized right down to the metro and the city level. And so this is probably one way that Google is starting to identify brands in local markets. Even if you're not Walmart, if there's a retail store that has 1,000 searches a month for that brand and everybody's clicking the same website, that probably means that is a branded entity, right? And the other piece of this is that entities are literally everywhere across these documents. And I think it's probably underappreciated the extent to which Google is identifying what websites are relevant for what terms based on what entities associated with those websites are mentioned alongside various other semantically definable topics, right? So I think that the mention of REI with outdoor stuff means that rei.com, because it's associated with the entity REI, is going to rank better for a whole bunch of outdoor stuff queries, even if it doesn't have as good of a sort of traditional backlink profile as some other competitor who's competing for the same keywords. That's just one example of where I think Google's algorithm is probably more sophisticated than a lot of SEOs are sort of taking into account.
So do you think that this would give a leg up to the local newspaper in terms of providing value in your market if you're just mentioned in the local newspaper as opposed to being mentioned
for sure
someplace else?
Absolutely. Well, I think that go ahead, Greg.
No, I was just going to say that the whole mentions conversation that we had with Rand, suggests a kind of a modified strategy to local link building, but that's another conversation.
Yeah, and Mike, I was going to say, I think it's, you and I have talked extensively at the AAN conferences that we've spoken at historically about the incredible value that all of these alternative weekly newspapers can and should be providing their digital customers. Even if they're marking documents on their website as sponsored, I still think that the mention of a given topic with a given local business from a really trusted website is probably going to help that business, that business's sort of semantic profile in its local market. And I think that's, if you're looking, if you are a local media sort of organization and you're looking for ways to better monetize your existing inventory in a way that helps you and helps your customers, like this to me would be a very ethical way to do that, is simply to be publishing content for your advertisers that is not just a sort of image and a special, but what is this business known for? What are they good at?
Profiles and interviews.
Profiles, exactly. More than just a citation, right? A citation, great. Okay, you have your name, address, phone on the website, which, by the way, that's very much included in these documents as something Google is looking at. But the semantic relevance for the terms that should be around that citation, I think, is something that's underappreciated.
And I can tell you from sort of vicarious exposure to the newspaper industry that these publications are not doing this. This is not. They're doing some services and they're reselling ads and certain kinds of things, but they're not leveraging their own properties and the value that they bring to give exposure to these customers.
Thanks for joining David, Mike, and Greg. To stay on top of the latest developments in local, subscribe to our newsletter at nearmedia.co. We'll see you next week.